You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education.
Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers and the paths they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hello, I'm Rob Webster. I'm an Associate Professor here at the IOE. On this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with Professor Louise Archer. Louise is the Carl Mannheim Professor of Sociology of Education at the IOE. She was previously the Director of the Centre for Research in Education in Science, Technology, Engineering and Mathematics at King's College in London. Louise's research focuses on educational identities and inequalities, particularly in relation to gender, ethnicity and social class. Today, we're going to talk to Louise about her research on young people's science and career aspirations. Hello, Louise. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Nice to join you.
Can I start by asking you about your own interest in science? Was it a subject you enjoyed at school?
Funnily enough, no, not particularly. Although I quite liked biology, I had a passionate dislike of physics. But I had a father who was a scientist and an engineer who very much believed in the importance of physics. So he conveyed that to me, but he told me, if you don't study physics, you can't understand life. So I went off and studied sociology.
That told him. Does having teachers and family who support and nurture your interest in science, is that something that we know makes a difference?
Yes, so the research we've done with over 40,000 young people to date shows that having a family member who's got a science or technology or engineering or maths background makes a really big difference to how likely you are to continue with the subject in the future.
Great. So let's talk about the research that you started at King's and you've brought to the IOE. That's the Aspires and Aspires 2 projects. So the reason for this research is connected to increasing participation in STEM subjects and careers. So who is missing out on STEM and why?
So there are big concerns that not enough young people are going into the so-called STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering and maths. And within that, there are particular issues around who does go in, that it's very socially patterned. So women, young people from working class backgrounds and some minority ethnic backgrounds are much less likely to go into subjects like physics and engineering in particular. So there are big concerns that we need to both increase participation overall, but also diversify it so a broader range of people continue with the subjects.
I'll ask you in a moment about some of the specific issues that you've raised in the Aspires 2 study, particularly the impact of GCSE science that you've identified. But first, could you give us some examples of the other factors that prevent students who are interested in science from going into STEM careers? You talk about inequalities within class and gender and socio-economic factors. So tell us how those play a part.
In the classic tradition of sociological research, the answer is obviously it's all very complex. So that our research identifies a mixture of factors that all come together. So it's not that any one thing determines what happens to a young person, but the three main areas that we find interconnect are issues around capital and what we call science capital, also educational factors. That's the education system actually makes it very difficult for a lot of young people to continue with science. And then also issues around the stereotypes we have of science and scientists. So particularly the ideas that you have to be very clever or that masculinity is associated with science. These play a part too.
So your work has identified some specific findings and implications around physics and particularly why so few girls continue with physics. So what's going on there?
So our research would say that it's both the images we have of physics, it's also the way young people experience physics, which is that very much the idea that you have to be like Sheldon off the Big Bang Theory, you have some sort of genius to continue with it. But also physics does a lot of work itself to stop young people continuing. So for example, we know that from other people's research that physics and subjects like chemistry tend to get marked harder at A level than other subjects. So it is harder to get an A, which means schools are then obliged to control who goes on to study these subjects. So it's typical that to study A-level physics, you would need to get an A at GCSE, or the equivalent now it's a 9, whereas in another subject like English, figures show that you're much more likely to be able to study that with a C. So it's not just that these stereotypes of needing to be clever come out of nowhere. We also have systems in place that make it harder for people to continue. So our research is very much saying, whereas to date, the focus has been on trying to change the young person, to change their attitudes and aspirations and the motivation to study science, we're saying we actually have to look at the system that we've got around it and change those practices as well.
I see. So you're pointing at something that there's something almost baked into the discipline itself that is somewhat self-defeating in trying to encourage more people in and to broaden out and to be a little bit more inclusive.
Yes, and self-defeating is an interesting take on it because in a way, yes, it is self-defeating. But in another way, our research suggests that it's actually self-promoting, because the reason we have these ideas around trying to restrict who carries on is very much tied to the elitism of physics. So the way a subject can stay very elite is to have very tight gatekeeping around who's allowed to study it, and having those ideas of having to be very clever to do it, again, contribute to that eliteness.
Your recent Aspires to project points a finger at the negative impact of double and triple science at GCSE. That sounds quite serious. So what's your message to policymakers in relation to that?
So we think that actually having this system of different awards in science, so double award, triple award, is really not helpful for trying to encourage more young people to continue with the subject. At the moment, what happens is that the majority of people take a double award, so about roughly around 75% of students would be taking that, compared to around 25% for triple award, and that this helps create the idea that, one, it stops the flow of young people through, but also again it reinforces that idea that really it's only the cleverest students or the highest attaining who can study science. So our message is that why do this for science and not for other subjects? It doesn't really help the ends that we're getting to.
Louise, you've mentioned a concept called science capital. Can you tell us what that is? And is it different to science knowledge?
Yes, so science capital is a concept we came up with in the Aspires project, really just as a way of holding together all the science-related knowledge, attitudes, ideas, behaviours and social contacts that you might have. So it is what science you know, but it's more than that. It's also what attitudes do you have about science? Do you do sciencey stuff in your spare time? Do you know people who either have science jobs or qualifications? Are you encouraged by other people and talk about it in your daily life? And our research shows the more science capital you have, statistically, more likely you are to see yourself as a science person and to continue with science after the age of 16.
It sounds like science capital, at least in part, is something to do with exposure to science, to scientists and to scientific, language and so on. So does that affect different young people in different ways?
Yes, so we see science capital is patterned differently according to different social groups. So for example, boys tend to record higher science capital than girls, young people from more privileged social backgrounds. So some of this relates to social inequalities more generally. So the more resources and experiences you have in your life, the more capital you have that can translate into you seeing yourself and being seen by other people as a kind of sciencey person, or feeling comfortable with science, that feeling that science is for me.
It sounds a bit like a sort of bucket or a bag that you carry around with you and you sort of accrue science capital as you go. Is that an analogy?
Yes, so we have used the bag analogy before as the idea it's the bag with all your different science related stuff in it. Although the problem we found with the bag metaphor is some people interpret it as that some young people having an empty bag, and that's not what we mean by it. Lots of things could be science capital, but it's also the job of, it depends what schools do, for example, to translate that capital into feeling sciencey or feeling that science is for me. So we also liken it to currency. So the value of your currency isn't fixed. It depends on the context or the country you're in as whether you can spend that currency. Is it just a piece of metal or a piece of paper, or is it recognised? So what we're trying to work with schools to help them to do is to recognise a broader range of what's in people's science capital bags, their currency, so to speak, so that we can link those, value them, use them, and help more young people feel that science is for me and make science more inclusive.
So that sounds, again, as you were saying earlier, you're trying to change the system or the environment rather than the individuals, in this case, the students. So for any of science teachers who might be listening, what are the kinds of things that they can work on in their schools to improve participation in the classroom? Have you got any real world examples of things that seem to work?
Yes, so on a sister project, two other projects, we've been working with teachers over a number of years to develop a science capital teaching approach. So this is it's basically a mindset, an approach that you can apply and use with any curriculum. So we've got projects across primary and secondary using this, and it's helping teachers to adopt what we call a more social justice mindset, and to not just focus on the content of what young people are learning, but actually to fix their relationship with science. So to broaden science, to value more sorts of experiences, to help young people learn science in a different way, so they're not experiencing it as this kind of very abstract, elitist subject that has nothing to do with their lives. It's very much about trying to help make a meaningful connection to a broader range of young people in science learning, teaching and learning.
Have you got an example of a classroom, a science teacher that you know who's done something to make scientific concepts more applied and more relevant in the real world to young people?
So teachers who use the approach very much are building on existing good teaching practice, but they're really tailoring the science examples that they use and the context to the particular students in their class. So the approach looks different in every classroom. So whereas teachers are great at contextualising, teachers using the approach go beyond this. They personalise and localise the science to their students. So, for example, teachers we've worked with in schools in London may be using very different examples and contexts, drawing on what their young people know and care about in learning science. And that may look quite different to a school up in Newcastle. So, for example, whereas a school I went to in East London, some of the young people there really loved their food. They knew a lot about cooking curry and rice, and when they were talking about mixtures and compounds in a chemistry lesson, they drew on examples of their home cooking there to explain the concepts. Whereas in a school in Newcastle, where there was a very football-orientated group of boys, they were learning about pressure and they were using examples of football studs. So those are just a couple of very stereotypical examples just to try and highlight how it can look different in different places. But the point is that each teacher really gets to know and really grounds the science within the lives, identities and experiences of the pupils in their class.
That's really interesting. I think the science of curry is something we can all get behind as well.
Yeah.
We are recording this podcast in separate locations because the global coronavirus health emergency has forced the UK into lockdown. Science is playing a key role in the fight against the virus, and we have scientists on TV every night, and some are even becoming household names. Do you think in time this experience could inspire a generation of scientists? And if so, what would policymakers have to do to make sure that young people can follow that aspiration?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it will be interesting to see whether it's something that inspires interest. I imagine it would. And also there's the wider climate crisis as well. I think to be able to support young people to be able to use science to make a difference in their lives, I think it's both about supporting young people into science careers, but it's also very much for us about active citizenship and public scientific literacy. And we think that part of our approach to it is not just focusing on teaching young people science knowledge and content, but also supporting their science agency, so their ability to take action in their lives, whether that's deciding how to protect your health, making sense of government advice, for example, in the current climate, or being able to take steps to protect the environment. All of these are really important. So what our approach is trying to do is not just to help young people to understand science, but really to develop and support their critical science agency, so they can take action on things in their lives and on things that matter to them.
I suppose this is where the inclusiveness of science comes in as well, because with things like both the coronavirus situation and the climate emergency as well, we need to be reaching out right across the spectrum of society, and it affects absolutely everybody in some way. So having ways of communicating the importance of science and what that means for our lives in what's likely to be a very changed world would seem more important now than ever.
Yes, definitely. And I think And again, it's not just the contextualizing of it. And I think it's that gap. Sometimes we have a disconnect between, let's say, school science and the real world science that young people are experiencing. So too often we interview lots of young people and sit in their science classes and so on. And too often I've heard young people say, I am interested in science, but the science I'm learning at school, it has no relevance to my everyday life. And I think we need to bridge that gap more.
They need to be able to see the appliedness and the relevance of it in their everyday lives. Like you were saying, these teachers who are using football and cooking to bring it to life.
Yeah, and it's also, again, supporting that notion of agency that I was talking about. So some of the teachers we're working with currently are doing some really exciting things to help young people make it not just an academic subject, but to actually make a difference through their science learning. So that can be the level of, in a school, doing an audit of, for example, if you're learning about energy, young people have done audits on how insulated the school is or how energy efficient their light bulbs are, and then have presented those findings back to the head teacher or to the governors to try and make changes. We've also had examples of teachers working with their young people who present their science knowledge on a particular topic back to a local council, for example, or to charities. So there's lots of ways that it not just brings the learning to life, but actually makes the young people science experts in their own right. They're producers of science. Their science does things in the world. And I think it's finding ways to enable them to do that can be really powerful.
Indeed, and a great added bonus as well of empowering young people and them experiencing what it is to be empowered and, I guess, trusted and heard.
Yes, I think it gets back to the core question of what's education about? Are we just trying to fill young people's minds with knowledge to pass exams, or actually we're trying to make agentic citizens in the world, people who, are using science to make decisions in their lives and to take action?
Brilliant, thank you. Louise, we must mention the awards that you've won for this work. In 2018 and 2019, you won awards from the British Educational Research Association and the Economic and Social Research Council. Both recognise the impact and public engagement success of Aspires. Congratulations on those.
Thank you.
I wonder if you have any messages for any researchers who might be listening about how best to communicate their work to the wider public.
Yes, I mean, this is something that we personally as a team really believe we are interested in, research that can make a difference. So it very much fits with the approach we come from. And I think it's also not for us, it's not just communicating our research, it's also listening and learning from our partners and our stakeholders, whether they're policy or practice or teachers, because we found it helps us to do better research by understanding the context they're working in and the things that they care about and need to know. And in turn, that's helped us translate our messages better. I think as academics, we're very aware that we often use quite jargonistic language. We talk at length, we write at length, and those aren't normal ways of communicating in a lot of the world, or not the most useful ways of communicating. So we feel that through doing this, it's both helped us refine our research, also just to understand how it is we need to translate it.
Excellent. So it's like a conversation, isn't it, with the wider world? As you've said, we can get a little bit carried away or blinkered because we sequester ourselves away and sort of crack on with what we believe to be important in academia. But it's out there in the real world that this stuff makes a difference. And if it's not being picked up, or it's not in a language or in a medium that can be easily accessed, then it feels like we're kind of missing out on something.
Yeah, so for us, it's very much not about waiting until the end of the project when we've got all our results and we just communicate them then. For us, we find it really important to engage with our key partners before the start, before we even think of the project. So when we put in for the most recent phase, we're now on Aspires 3, the first thing we did before we drafted anything was to meet with our key partners and to get their input and ideas and to thread it through from pre-design to design to through your methodology, through your analysis, and then into your dissemination as well. And to keep that conversation as very much a whole part of the project and not a little bit stuck at the end.
So you just mentioned that there is a third phase to Aspire. So can you tell us a little bit about what the aims of that project are?
Yes, so it's basically extending and continuing our existing Aspires research. So Aspires studies a cohort of young people from the age of 10 and now up to the age of 23. So the most recent Aspires 3 funding continues from age 20 to 23.
So that's carrying, I guess, sort of through the university years and then out into the workplace. So you'll be able to track whether or not this does carry forward into realising career aspirations. Is that the aim?
Yes, so it's a really exciting phase for us coming out of education. Some of our young people are already in work or training, some in higher education. So being able to look at how young people make choices and transitions, how they end up following their pathways in life is really interesting and important to us.
Louise, you've created some resources to support STEM participation. Can you tell us a little about what these are and where we can find them?
Yes, we have various web pages for our different projects. The Aspires research can be found on our website, and that has links to all of our various publications and information about the research, what it involves. We've also got links to the teaching resources that we've developed, so the Science Capital teaching approach in secondary. We've also got a current primary project, which again is on our website. And we've also been doing work in the informal science learning sector, so working with, for example, zoos, science centres, coding clubs, digital arts centres, to understand about young people's engagement with science out of school too. Again, all on our website.
Excellent. So no excuses for not knowing where to look or what to find. Louise, thank you for joining us on the podcast and sharing your award-winning research. Fascinating topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You can follow Louise's work on Twitter at Aspires Science. You can read more on the UCL website too at ucl.ac.uk/IOE-Aspires. We'll also include these links in the show notes. There are more podcast episodes from the IOE ready and waiting for you. Just search IOE Podcasts on your favourite podcasting app and have a plunder. Check out other episodes of Research for the Real World and our playlist of music chosen by our guests and the IOE podcast team. That's also on our webpage. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Rob Webster. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.